Now I want to go back and I want to talk about politics. So we'll go through politics and power. Because of the situation with high protective tariffs in the 1890s, so we're going back to American political history during this period, right? Because of high protective tariffs in the 1890s, American farmers were hurting in a dramatic way. Socioeconomic inequality had grown dramatically by the 1890s in American life. There was this sense that American corporations had tremendous power in American life, and so did America's big banks as well. One of the particular targets for that, of course, is J.P. Morgan. If you're a farmer, you operate in a variety of ways, but each of those ways are going to be tied to the big business of the period. First of all, you're using the railroad system to ship your goods to markets across the country. Second, to expand in farming meant taking out mortgages and loans, so you're going to be tied to America's banking system. Third, you sell your products in the global marketplace. So you're dependent upon American tariff policies. Well, if those tariff policies are to protect American businesses, in retrospect, they hurt American farmers quite a bit, because that means that foreign competition in farming, as you're trying to sell your agricultural goods on the global stage, right, makes it harder for you to actually compete in international markets. What farmers want to do is level the playing field. For us, this is the beginning of what we think of, go ahead and write this down, as progressivism, right? They call themselves the populists as early as 1892 and even as early as 1891. And the Populist Party wants a number of things. Now, these should sound familiar to you because we've been through the 20th century, the second half, and now all of a sudden we're seeing the roots where some of these things come from, but even we could step back to Hamilton and talking about some of these things. But in the modern sense, right, the modern progressive movement really begins here. What do populists and later progressives want? Well, they want more government involvement in the economy, right? What do they mean by that in the 1890s and early 20th century? They want the government to regulate, for example, public transportation, to regulate the railroad system. They want the American government to regulate the banking system. They want antitrust laws, which, by the way, had been passed in 1890. The Sherman Antitrust Act was supposed to break up American big business. Populists want those laws to actually be enforced. There's another major issue in American politics during this period, and it really comes from the period before, but we're going to add it up here, right? And they are political machines. You see, political machines operated in most major cities across the United States. As the country grew, we see this shift beginning in the 1890s, right? As the frontier line disappears, we begin to see this rural-urban shift in the American population. The growth of American industry was bringing in tremendous numbers of immigrants from all across the world, but mostly from Central and Eastern Europe by this period. So what's really interesting is that the rise of political machines meant that politicians could essentially take advantage of immigrant voters in large numbers. Now, when we say that, right, how do populists want to deal with that? Senators were selected by state legislatures, according to the Constitution. Well, it's easy to sway state legislators if you have political machine politics, because political machine politics is local politics, right? So what you could do is you could always get control of the U.S. Senate, right? Because you could use local politics to influence local elections. And therefore, you could always keep the same senators in power, and you could always put your slate of interests ahead of that of the country. Most of the time, those interests were tied, of course, to big business interests. If you're the populace, what do you want to change about that? Well, you want U.S. senators to be directly elected by the American people in their respective states. Okay? You want to limit or provide term limits for politicians so that you don't have the same political voice and power at the behest of a political machine for perpetuity. Okay? And the other thing that you want, right, is somewhat interesting to us today because most of us paid this a couple of weeks ago. You want a graduated income tax. Why do you want a graduated income tax? You want a graduated income tax because you want a level playing field for all Americans, right? And you want the federal government to essentially be funded by all Americans, a representative of all Americans, and not just corporate Americans who can afford to buy, right, their political interests. The other thing that you want if you're the populace, and I think this is actually an interesting move in the 1890s, it's sort of reminiscent of some of the issues that we've seen today in this respect, is that you not only want immigration restrictions if you're the populace, which really gets them in trouble somewhat. We'll see that here in a moment. But you also want to lower tariff rates across the board. That should make sense to everybody in here, right? Because that provides more of a level playing field for all Americans, but particularly for American farmers. By 1896, the populists are ready to run a national campaign for the first time. And they ally themselves, strangely enough, with the Democratic Party. In 1896, the party standard bearer is a little-known congressman, but brilliant speaker, William Jennings Bryan. What's interesting about William Jennings Bryan is he's sort of like the Bernie Sanders of today to some extent. He speaks to large crowds. He travels across the country on a whistle-stop tour in 1896. He makes the socioeconomic divide in American life the centerpiece of his campaign. But there's another issue. It's really an economic issue, and I did put it up here. It's not just tariff policies in the economy that are a part of the equation in 1896. There's also a currency issue. And the issue is, do you incorporate silver into the American currency supply or money supply, or do you still hold to the gold standard, right? Why do farmers want this? Now, it would sound strange to all of us today, but the reason why they favor what we call bimetallism, having silver and gold as a part of the money supply, is so that there could be more currency in circulation. The reason why it seems strange to us, because all of us, the first thing that we equate with that, right, is rampant inflation. The reason why it makes sense to a farmer is because farmers operate seasonally. You only sell your goods at harvest time at certain points in the year. So why do farmers want an expansion of the money supply? So that they can keep more cash on hand, right? If you're a banker and you want the value of your currency to stay more stable, if you're a big corporation and you want the value of your currency to stay more stable, then you favor having less money in circulation, right? So that means that you probably favor having the gold standard, right? But what else is the gold standard tied to? Well, it's tied to the amount of gold that the United States actually can possess, right? Or that we can mine and have on hand. This also led to another issue, right? How much mining in the American West can you do without crushing the environment in the late 19th century and still have enough supply on hand? So we have to think silvers also and gold are also used for other things other than for currency, but that's the usual association that we make with both. So the currency issue is also a major issue in the 1896 election. To make a long story short, Bryan loses. And he loses in 1896 by a narrow majority. But something else is introduced into American politics. Those big businessmen, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, John Rockefeller, contribute heavily to the campaign of Republican William McKinley. This is really the first time in American politics where we actually see big money, corporate money, being involved behind a major political party in a very significant way to get a president, a particular president, William McKinley, elected. Why would you elect McKinley if you're a big corporate baron like John Rockefeller, for example? Because McKinley favored what from 1890 that gave us Hawaii and Cuba and the Spanish-American War, all these possessions? They favor high tariffs. And high tariffs do what? Protect American industries. So why elect William McKinley? Because he looks very favorable to the interests of big business. But there's a problem with electing McKinley. From 1896 to 1900, McKinley oversees America's involvement in the Spanish-American War. There's a gold rush in Alaska, so this idea of moving to the gold standard looks like a good thing, at least at the immediate point in time, right, with the Klondike Gold Rush. But in 1900, McKinley's running again against William Jennings Bryan. He's looking for a running mate. There is this fear that McKinley might lose. So McKinley takes on the ultimate political maverick. Now, Theodore Roosevelt had made a name for himself in the administration of Benjamin Harrison in the early 1890s as a civil service commissioner. He'd also made a name for himself as the police commissioner of the NYPD in New York. He had been a state assemblyman or legislator in New York in the 1880s. But by the time of the Spanish-American War, Theodore Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. In some respects, it's Theodore Roosevelt's desire and his discipleship of Alfred Thayer Mahan that brought us into the Spanish-American War in the first place. But once the Spanish-American War broke out, Roosevelt himself becomes involved in an infantry unit, of course, the famous Rough Riders, and ultimately he becomes one of the great heroes of the Spanish-American War. Well, at the end of that war, Roosevelt is so popular that in 1898, he's actually elected as the governor of New York, his home state. From 1898 to 1900, Theodore Roosevelt has a reputation for dealing with big business. Not quite the trust buster that you will think of him in the role of President of the United States, but somewhat akin to it. Against his better judgment and against the advice of some of his advisors, because of Roosevelt's popularity as a Republican, even though he's really a closet progressive, McKinley decides to add Roosevelt as his running mate. And we all know the story. In September 1901, William McKinley is attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, touting the growth of American industry. And when he does, in the middle of at the end of his speech, as he's walking off of the podium, he's starting to shake hands with well-wishers. One of those well-wishers is an anarchist by the name of Leon Czolgosz, who reaches out his hand, which contains a pistol, and he fires 2 shots into William McKinley's chest. A few days later, William McKinley dies from his wounds, and that damn cowboy, as McKinley's advisors had called him, particularly William Hanna, his campaign advisor, that damn cowboy, Theodore Roosevelt, becomes President of the United States. And what's about to happen in American politics is going to be a political revolution. Why? That's because TR, Theodore Roosevelt, is really the first of our progressive presidents that dominate the first 2 decades in American political life in the 20th century. Let's think about Roosevelt for a moment and progressivism. If progressivism came from populism at its roots or at its core, it adds another group of people by the dawn of the 20th century. They are the muckrakers, right? And who are the muckrakers? Well, they're really investigative journalists. Okay? Give you a couple examples of these people. Ida Tarbell, journalist who helps bring down Standard Oil, right? She's consistently, beginning in 1902 until 1907, writes a series of articles in magazines like McClure's. And what's the purpose of that? to detail the shady dealings and business practices of John D. Rockefeller. By 1911, her work yields fruit. Even though Standard Oil is sued by the government in 1907, by 1911, Standard Oil is forced to divest and break apart. Lincoln Steffens is another example of a muckraker. Lincoln Steffens is writing about political machines in cities like St. Louis and Chicago and the evils of machine politics. Probably the two most famous muckrakers, though, that we're well aware of is first Upton Sinclair. In 1906, Upton Sinclair writes a book that was supposed to be about the working conditions in America's meatpacking factories and food industry in Chicago. However, the conditions inside the factories and what Americans would be consuming appalled even Theodore Roosevelt himself when he read the book. It's said that Roosevelt said it became nauseated, he was sick reading the book, right? The other example of a muckraker, very important investigative journalist, I'll give you two more. The first one that comes to mind to me is the great Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis is the first to use the NYPD for assistance in his project, but he puts together an essay into a book of photographs, a photographic collection that we still to this day refer to by the name of How the Other Half Lives. What was Jacob Riis attempting to do as early as 1889? And maybe in some respects we can begin this era with Jacob Riis and people like him and a progressive tint in American politics for much of this period in American life. I'm watching my watch too. What Jacob Riis called attention to was the plight of America's poor in America's urban areas. Immigrants that were living in slums and tenements. There's no running water, there's no sanitation systems. Children without playgrounds or the ability to go to school. In fact, child labor was one of the major targets of the muckrakers by 1912. And it's a series of photographs by the muckrakers by 1912 that begin the process of the American government trying to take the first steps to deal with problems in American life, such as child labor. But what really were the muckrakers interested in dealing with? They were interested in dealing with the evils as they saw it that had been caused by America's rapid industrial growth and therefore rapid urban growth too. The other person who is a muckraker, without a doubt, is Ida Tarbell. Is Ida B. Wells. Good grief. Ida B. Wells is, she is the first person, female journalist living in Memphis, Tennessee, to call attention to the practices of lynching in the American South and to call attention to the evils of segregation. Ida B. Wells, along with W.E.B. Du Bois, are one of the founding members, two of the founding members of an organization that will be important to the civil rights movement throughout the 20th century and even beyond to this day. And that's the creation of the NAACP. It really does come out of this progressive era, but so does segregation too. Segregation had begun before the progressive era. It had begun before 1890. But it's the 1896 Supreme Court ruling over the issue of public transportation in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson that gave us segregation by law. So think of Roosevelt becoming president when all of these undercurrents in American life are actually occurring. So what progressive victories does the Roosevelt administration give the American people? Well, the Hepburn and Elkins Acts, guys might want to write these down because they're both very important. The Hepburn and the Elkins Act really strengthened the ability for the federal government to regulate interstate commerce, okay? Particularly in regulating America's railroad industry. TR, or Theodore Roosevelt, another victory for the progressives, actually initiates 44 antitrust lawsuits and does break up a few monopolies, such as J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities Trust, when he is President of the United States. Roosevelt gets for consumer protection advocates the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Acts passed, right? Now, these definitely are in large part, right, reaction to Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, right? The other victory that progressives get, and I think it's really important for us to note during the Roosevelt years, is a renewed interest in protecting the American environment. Roosevelt establishes the National Forest Service through the Newlands Act. He also establishes the first bird sanctuaries and wildlife sanctuaries and refuges across the United States. He sets aside land for national parks. So while we think of the Roosevelt administration for things like the Roosevelt Corollary, saying that the United States is going to keep foreign powers from being involved in Latin America, and we think of the Roosevelt administration because of the creation of the Panama Canal, and we think of Theodore Roosevelt because he brokers the peace agreement between Russia and Japan, bringing the Russo-Japanese War to an end, and him winning the Nobel Prize for doing that. We also have to think of him as our first progressive president because of the areas that he improves in consumer protection, the areas that he improves in dealing with big business, and two, because of the efforts in conservation that he gives Americans during his 2 terms in office. Roosevelt doesn't run again in 1908. Instead, his hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft, becomes the President of the United States in 1908. Taft is an interesting fellow, somebody who really wasn't a politician and didn't want to be one, right? He ends up becoming President of the United States from 1909 to 1913. But what does Taft do for progressives, right? Well, Taft's more of a moderate. However, you might want to write this down, Taft sets aside more land for protection than the Roosevelt administration. The Taft administration sues more big businesses and breaks up more big businesses with antitrust lawsuits than the Roosevelt administration, 44 to 101 during Taft's administration. In fact, Standard Oil is broken up during Taft's administration. But Taft gets into an argument, an age-old argument about conservation that brings Roosevelt back into the picture in 1912. And that's this idea in the environment, right? There's a difference between conservation and preservation. Preservation means that you don't touch land. You leave it to be pristine. Conservation means that you use the resources from a piece of land, but you also put them back to their natural state after their use. You manage the landscape, right? The head of the National Forestry Service was a man by the name of Gifford Pinchot. Because Pinchot did not agree with the interests of the Taft administration and is fired by the Taft administration, it angered Roosevelt so much that Roosevelt actually runs for the presidency as a progressive Bull Moose Party candidate, third party candidate in 1912. Well, what happens is really interesting in the election of 1912. Hopefully you guys are writing this down because maybe you remember this and maybe you don't, right? But Roosevelt and Taft split the Republican ticket in 1912. And that gives us our first Southerner in the White House since the Civil War, and only our second Democrat in the White House since the end of the Civil War, in Woodrow Wilson. Wilson had been an academic. He had been the president of Princeton University. He had served as the governor of New Jersey. He's definitely a progressive in some respect. But in other respects, the Wilson administration also turns back the clock on major American initiatives in some respects, right? Let's talk about what Wilson turns back the clock on first. The first full-length feature film in American history, silent film, comes out in 1915, The Birth of a Nation. Wilson actually supported, even had this very much racist film actually staged in the White House. Wilson brings segregation into the White House. Theodore Roosevelt had actually invited Booker T. Washington to the White House, the first African American to be invited to the White House. Wilson actually turns down meetings with the NAACP. He will not meet with African American leaders in the White House. We also see a resurgence in the Ku Klux Klan during the years when Wilson is in the White House, which makes it seem strange to us that Wilson, right, is a progressive. But let's think about what Wilson gets passed for progressives. Okay, now this is a long list of acts, but starting with, okay, we have to start with two constitutional amendments, right? So in 1912, the 16th Amendment is passed, okay? And the 16th Amendment gives us a graduated income tax. That's actually passed by the Taft administration, but comes into play during Wilson's years. The 17th Amendment is passed in 1913, Wilson's first year in office. That led to the direct election of U.S. senators. Now remember, the populists first and the progressives have wanted these victories for quite some time, right? And now they become what? Law, constitutional amendments, right? Added to the Constitution. In 1914, the Wilson administration passes the Clayton Antitrust Act, which does what? Breaks up big businesses so they can do what? Compete with each other to make better products for American consumers, right? Wilson gets the Siemens Act of 1915 and the Adamson Act passed. What do? They give us a 40-hour work week. They give us an 8-hour work day. Take care, guys. Wilson also reforms child labor. He gets the Fair Employment Practices Act passed, right? Wilson also does something else. In 1913, after J.P. Morgan dies, the federal government creates the Federal Reserve. Why? To regulate America's banking and financial system. So in some respects, Wilson does what? He gives those victories to the progressive movement that they had wanted for quite some time. Here's another victory, progressive victory for Woodrow Wilson. In 1917, the National Park Service is established, right? And it's established for what? The preservation of American lands, right? We have to think about something else, though, that happens during the Wilson years, though he's not entirely in favor of it, right? And that is that in 1920, the 19th Amendment is passed, giving women the right to vote. This is pretty interesting, right? Because this changes the calculus of American politics throughout the 20th century and has much more of an effect in the 21st, right? The other thing that happens during the Wilson administration, women are also very much a part of. Since the 1830s and 1840s, women had been an important part of the temperance movement, right? By 1918, in the midst of World War I, with anti-German hysteria helping back this cause, prohibition, the 18th Amendment, making the sale and manufacture of alcoholic beverages and their consumption illegal, becomes law. We have to think for a moment. When World War I occurred, it led to a sense of nativism here in the United States. Because Wilson was dealing with a divided American electorate because of the number of immigrants who had come recently into the United States. On the one hand, it made it easier for prohibition to be passed. On the other hand, right, it made it easier to demonize people who were in America's labor movement for speaking out against issues related to the war. We have to think for a moment. There had been a fear of American organized labor, particularly for quite some time by American big business leaders. It really came to a head, however, during World War I. For two reasons. There is this fear that communism could be infiltrating parts of the labor union movement, giving us a Red Scare after World War I. But the other fear is an even simpler one. No matter what war Americans have been involved in, it's safe to say, right, that it's America's working class that has fought those wars. And so if you have a number of American laborers who are not supportive of being involved in a war effort, right, it makes it awfully difficult, right, to recruit and mobilize the number of young men that you're going to have to fight in a global conflict like World War I. So Congress passes two acts during the midst of World War I. One has to do a lot with the anti-immigrant hysteria. That's the Espionage Act of 1917. The other act, right, is the Sedition Act of 1918, right? And the Sedition Act had to do a lot in respect with the fear of these immigrant groups who were heavily a part of the labor union movement. But even to step back to the 1890s, you know, there was a fear that socialism was becoming a major part of the labor union movement. There were anarchists who were a part of the labor union movement. In fact, Leon Czolgosz, who assassinates McKinley, was an anarchist, right? So we have to think that there is a fear of immigrants that really rears its ugly head by World War I, by the time World War I is fought. But World War I really enhanced it to a great deal. And then after the war, the Red Scare of the early 1920s drove anti-immigrant hysteria in the United States to even greater heights than what it had ever been, right? That for us means that there should be no mistaking, and I'm kind of jumping from politics to here because it makes more sense to do it, okay? There is this idea of, why should we call people Irish Americans? Even Theodore Roosevelt's writing about this and saying this. Why should we call them German Americans? If they're not willing to become just Americans, right, why should we allow them to have their own enclaves or neighborhoods, ethnic neighborhoods in the United States? Why should they not be subsumed into the greater whole of American society? And we have to think, this certainly leads to demonization of the labor union movement in the early 1920s, the questioning of whether America is a melting pot or not, or should be, right? But it also leads to something else. Go ahead and write this down. In 1924, the United States establishes its first major immigrant quotas. Now, Americans had restricted immigrants before. In 1882, we restricted Chinese with the Chinese Exclusion Act for the very first time. But now we're restricting immigrants from European countries in a very profound way, particularly those from the belligerent nations of World War I by the mid-1920s, including the Soviet Union as well, right? Why? Very simple. There's this fear of bringing those outside political ideas, anarchism, socialism, communism, into American life, right? In fact, when we think of the Ku Klux Klan, we typically think of the Klan at the end of the Civil War and then the Klan again in the 1950s and 1960s. But the Klan of the 1920s was also very much focused on this idea of nativism as well during this period too, as well as cleaning up American life to a certain extent. And we're going to get into that in a moment too. There's also a great migration that occurs during this period from 1890 through World War I, and again after the Depression with the Second World War. What is this? It has to do with segregation. It has to do with the practice of lynching. It has everything to do with the growth of American big businesses in places like Detroit and Chicago and New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore, right? African Americans are looking to do what? Leave the segregated South, leave behind the practice of lynching. And they, much like the immigrants of the period, move into their own ethnic neighborhoods, such as Harlem, for example, in New York, the south side of the city of Chicago, the east side of the city of Detroit, for example, right? What we have to think of is this: why are African Americans moving north, aside from segregation and the practice of lynching driving them in this direction? There's a couple of different factors that are at work here. The first is this: when World War I began, so did the mobilization of U.S. industry to fight the war. Also, American industrial growth was beginning to incorporate assembly lines and beginning to pay, in some factories, African American workers the same wage as white workers. Henry Ford's Dearborn factories in Michigan did just that. African American workers began to take notice of these opportunities, and they're simply moving into northern cities to be able to find work. Now that leads to, in the 1920s, of course, right, to this tremendous flowering of African American culture, and really in such a way that white culture in the major urban areas across the United States is beginning to take notice. Now, you refer to this flowering of poetry and music and literature during this period as the Harlem Renaissance. What I think we should, or you also may see the huge influence, of course, that it has in the development of the jazz age itself, right? And in jazz and blues music, of course, during the period. But I want us to think about it in another broader, encompassing way. I want us to think about this movement of the Great Migration as being seminal to the development of American popular entertainment and popular culture. And I want you to think about it in the sense that this is the beginning of African Americans having a huge influence on the development of American popular culture.